And we are live, and I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Heart to Heart with Bree. Tonight's guest is my friend Shirley Barclay. Would you please introduce yourself to the viewers?
Sure, I'm Shirley Barclay. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I work with a variety of different clients, from couples to children to teenagers, just a variety of different issues.
Well, I'm looking forward to us covering this topic. And tonight's topic is a conversation about what betrayal trauma does to the brain. And, when I saw this video on YouTube, I thought about you right away, Sister Shirley. I wrote in my notes that I wanted to do this topic. So I would like to say to those who, when you tune in, if you have a question, please feel free. Say hello. Let us know you're here. So the first question is, what is betrayal trauma?
Well, betrayal trauma is is a deep rooted hurt that occurs when there's betrayal. When we talk about betrayal, it is a breaking of trust and versus in terms of the expectations that you had for a relationship. Most of these relationships are attachment relationships, but it can also happen in work or commercial settings as well. So it's where there's a breach in trust when dealing with expectations from a relationship.
Yes. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. Thank you so much. So my next question is, what are the symptoms?
The symptoms that you're going through some kind of betrayal is usually you're on an emotional roller coaster. You don't feel like you know which way is up. Sometimes you have difficulty eating, some people overeat, some people don't eat, some you have sleep disturbance where you have a hard time falling asleep, or interrupted sleep where you're not able to stay asleep. Stress, anxiety, depressive symptoms, and some characteristics of PTSD as well, which is where you have hypervigilance, mood swings, brain fog. There's quite a lot of symptoms. Not being able to focus and concentration, lack of concentration. So there are a wide variety of symptoms that you can have. You may not have all of them, you may have some of them. So it varies from person to person.
Thank you for joining us, Irene. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I have to, I am hoping that there are people as they're listening, they may recognize some of the things they may have experienced, but they didn't really understand there was actually a name for all of this. Because, after I saw the video and I had a chance to reflect, I realized that I'd experienced some of this. That's why I really wanted to cover this topic because, which is leading to my next question. Does betrayal trauma leave individuals feeling stuck? Because I remember going through that for a long time because I didn't understand what was happening to me.
Yes, you can feel stuck because there are different phases that you go through. And if you don't know what's going on, yeah, you're going to feel stuck. And that's why it's important to reach out and get help. Because if not, you may be stuck in the depressive phase, or you might be just stuck in bargaining, or you might be stuck in just being shocked or just in denial, not believing that it's really happening or it's really happened.
Would you say that betrayal trauma can affect one's self esteem?
Definitely, because your whole sense of self is impacted. Because with betrayal trauma, it it impacts you on all the different levels, like emotionally, spiritually. You don't know what's real from what's not real, what to trust, what's not to trust. Socially, your whole self-image, your other relationships are impacted at times because you're not sure if you can trust these other people.
Yes.
Physically, your whole body image, your sense of self, you know, you think something is wrong with you, or different with something, and so it impacts you in a wide range.
Okay, so I will have to ask you, please give us some examples of betrayal trauma.
Well, there are several different categories. The one we start with is parental, just because with parental trauma, it's it's so devastating because it impacts children. And when you're a child, you depend on your parents for your survival or your caregiver. So that trauma impacts you on a deep level when your basic needs are not met, or where you're abused, or you're not protected. So that's one of the deepest ones because it's usually in childhood. Sometimes you can have parental trauma in adults as well. Then the other one is with intimate partners, because you're sharing a part of yourself with that person. It's an intimate attachment. So the more attached your relationship, the more traumatic the betrayal. And so in those intimate relationships, the trauma of affair, uh, through whether it's emotional affairs or sexual affairs or whatever the level, or affairs through pornography, it's all violation. You feel violated and you feel betrayed. And so it changes your whole sense of self. The other one is Another one is institutional betrayal, where the person that you depend on, or the agency that you depended on to protect you, sometimes they will protect the perpetrator instead of you. And
Yeah.
so that creates an institutional betrayal. And then you have betrayal on the levels of friendships, like somebody who you thought would have your back and they didn't. They kind of stabbed you in the back, or they were the ones who cheated, who your mate cheated with, or sometimes just friends who just leave, they just abandon you. So yes, those friendships are also relationships that you've poured into for years, and so you have attachment bond with them, and so the betrayal is traumatic.
Okay. Now, would you call a job layoff, that could that be seen as betrayal trauma? Someone being laid off after working at a company for years?
Yes, especially if there was like an understanding that this would be something more long term. They had a plan in place, and then they didn't follow through with the expectations. Especially if with the layoff, they didn't provide any kind of compensation, any kind of severance, any kind of protection to help the person as they transition, then they'll feel more betrayed. Because if it was something that they were expecting, or something that came about and they work with them on, then it's not as traumatic. But if there are not things in place to help transition, then it's more traumatic. So it could vary in the level of trauma.
Okay. Welcome, Mikey Go. Thank you for joining us once again. Now, let me ask you this, Sister Shirley. Do you think this is something that could even take place in the church? Because I know that I've heard the term church hurt. And I know that there are people, sometimes they give up on God, they give up on their church family. Do you think that betrayal trauma could be a part of this? And maybe sometimes it's due to a misunderstanding, a lack of communication. So I'm just asking you for your opinion on this.
Definitely, definitely. There's a lot of church betrayal. I've had clients dealing with that, especially with different ranges churches. I've seen it in small churches and I've seen it in larger churches. But the expectations that they had, thinking that certain things will be upheld in terms of certain values, and that was not. And so we have that, and we also have what we call religious abuse, where religion is used to manipulate people. And so you can have institutional or church abuse or church trauma in that respect.
Now, I've seen quite a few documentaries about different cults.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are people when they go into these cults, they go in with an expectation. They think they'll have a closer walk with God. In some cases, they think they found God in these cult leaders. Now, when people finally get to that point where they see the truth and they find out maybe they've been duped or whatever it is, do you think betrayal trauma can take place in a situation like that also?
Yes. Sometimes when people start to find out is when the cult leader kind of zeroes in and try to get them to do something crazy,
Yeah.
like with Jim Jones, have them drink together, or with David Koresh, they're all trying to follow the asteroid or whatever, and so
Yes.
they get desperate and seeing that their followers are waking up to what's going on. So yes, definitely.
What are the four stages of betrayal trauma?
Well, it's similar to with grief.
Okay.
So the stages, people have a hard time with the shock, like believing that this is really happening, shock and denial. Then some people say obsession and anger. Some people divide it out into like seven, but it's really, like four groups. And then you have the bargaining. Some people say they have bargaining. It's not like you don't go through each phase one at a time. It's something where you kind of shuffle back and forth. And then you have the depression, of
Hmm.
course, and the final phase is the acceptance. So it's a process and you shuffle back and forth. Some people say they don't go through some of them, some people say they have all of them. So it depends.
Okay. Since the death of my father, there have been certain situations I have relived in my mind. And I replay these things. Sometimes it's like I don't know if I'm trying to resolve a past issue or simply just trying to have a better understanding. But one of the things that stands out the most is when I would say under the age of 10. I remember my father, he just left. And for a couple weeks, it's like we didn't know where he was. And, when my mom found out where he was, we ended up being reunited with him.
Mhm,
But for years, that was something that stuck in my mind. Like I was trying to figure out why did he do that? And I remember I was like 40, 41 years old, and I actually asked him about it. When
mhm,
I asked him, I don't think he really understood why I was asking.
mhm,
But
mhm,
I was asking him because what I was hoping he would say was that I was going through a bad time and I really missed you guys. And I was glad when you guys came back, when you
mhm,
came and found me and we
mhm,
reunited as a family. But he did not say that.
mhm,
You know,
mhm.
he
Yeah.
basically said that he didn't like where we were living and he decided he wanted his old job back. And I remember thinking, but if you knew that you wanted your old job back, why didn't you discuss it with my mom? Why would you just leave and not come back? You
Yeah.
know? And if I'm asking him this when I'm in my 40s,
Mhm,
so I don't think he understood, wow, this happened like 30 something years ago and she's
mhm,
asking me about this now. So it was like trying to connect it to when my mom finally had enough of him and we moved to Jamaica. I had to reconcile, with my real thinking was that because sometimes we create fantasies in our mind,
mhm,
because I always wondered, like, he knew where we were because my mom never hid where we were. His
mhm,
family members knew of us. We visited with them, and it's like, why didn't you come to see us?
mhm,
I mean, you knew where we were.
mhm,
So those were some of the dots that I was trying to connect, and he died with this, it was unresolved, because we never really spoke about it truthfully. I didn't tell him how deep these things really bothered me. So,
mhm.
would you say this could be something that could be considered a betrayal trauma? And if so, how can we resolve these things like once a person is passed on? Because once they're passed on, there's nothing that we can do about it.
Well, there's nothing you can do about it with them, but you
Yes,
still have to go through that healing process, that healing journey. And so it's important because you were trying to reconcile with him, but he wasn't recognizing what you were going through, why you needed to know. So he wasn't able to give you what you were looking for. You were still looking for that blessing, for that, love, and that I
yes,
cared, but I wasn't available or I couldn't,
yes,
but he wasn't even able to give that much. So so that's where you have to accept in yourself that okay, this is all he had. He couldn't give more than he had. And then you working on releasing, going through that letting go process and being able to accept what was and move forward from there. Because that letting go process is important because holding on is what helps keep you stuck.
yes. Yes. So I'll ask you this.
Mm.
So if in our relationships, if we do not feel that we were loved, you know, does that make us unlovable? Because I know some people get stuck in that. Like they think I'll never have a great relationship or I'll never have connections, genuine connections, because they keep associating themselves with these past betrayals. What would you say about that?
Well, what's happening is that they're stuck in the anger and grief. So they're not able to move forward and they miss out on that healing process and discovering who they really are. And so that anger takes over their life. It's usually more in the form of resentment though.
Yes,
So they're not lashing out at people every day, but there's this underlying toxic resentment that they're holding, and that's what keeps you stuck. And so we have to go and clean out that resentment so that healing will come. It's like a deep wound, and before they stitch up a deep wound, they always clean it out,
yes,
and you have to see the skin looking more red. If it's dead skin, they have to clean all that stuff out. And the longer you sit on it, the longer, it's the more cleaning out you're gonna have to do. And when you're going through it, it's gonna hurt because you're like starting over that whole process. So you're digging at it again, clean it out, and then stitching it up. So it's the same healing process that we look at when we have a physical wound. We have to look at a healing process when we have an emotional wound.
yes, yes. I mean, most definitely, because, when my father passed away, I had to make up my mind that I did not want to be bitter, I did not want to be angry. I wanted to let all of that go. Because I realized that, like you said, he gave what he had. He couldn't
Mhm,
give me any more than that. It's what he knew, it's what he had. And I had to focus on the fact that one of the things that surprised me was that I actually ended up missing my father, which I didn't think I would. And I found myself, because I was making up my mind to let go of the hurt and what I perceived as betrayal. And it helped me to really, you know, find myself having more of the good memories. And it wasn't that I was trying to create a fantasy about the past or, romanticize the past.
mhm,
But it was like I just wanted to move on with my life. I didn't want to carry the burden of resentment because I got tired of playing these scenes over in my mind over
mhm,
and over. It's like trying to change them, which, listen, I know in my heart I couldn't do that. But
mhm,
for some reason, I feel like there was a young girl inside of me
mhm.
that was trying to rewrite the past, if that makes sense. Is that a
Yes.
common thing?
Yes, that's post traumatic stress disorder, it's and it could be chronic because it's happened so long ago, but it's not resolved. So we call it chronic because it's not resolved. But it's hard to let go unless you acknowledge. And I think you, at that point, you acknowledge what you were feeling and then you
Yes.
try to address it with him. And then when you couldn't get it addressed with him, you had to come up with something in
Yes.
order for you to process those emotions and allow yourself that chance to grieve, because you still have to grieve what you wanted or what you should have had, because you
Yes.
didn't have your dad there. So it was something that was missing. It was a loss, but you necessarily didn't see the full weight of the loss at that time. But
Yes.
now as an adult, you were seeing some of the things that you missed and the loss. So you have to let yourself grieve it. Acknowledging and grieving before you let go is important, because if you don't acknowledge it, then you're not gonna know what you're letting go. And so it's important to acknowledge first.
Yes. Opal, thank you so much for joining us. So, my next question is, what are the psychological effects of betrayal?
Well, there are different varying effects depending on how that person may manage the betrayal. The sooner a person gets help, the better. Some people, because they delay in getting help, their their symptoms become more acute. Most people go through obsessive preoccupation and thoughts, like to keep going through your mind. Hypervigilance, paranoia, you're worried all the time. The problems we talked about, like sleeping and eating, anxiety, depression, um, just difficulty concentrating, focusing, difficulty like balancing emotions. You high today, you're low, you're up and down. Um, it's just an upheaval. Some people have like intrusive thoughts. They feel shame or embarrassment even though they didn't do anything, because they're thinking about how they're being perceived. They may feel inadequate or having resentment and rage. Sometimes the symptoms even affect a person physically, where because of not eating and sleeping, they could go into like mania, where they just going and just can't stop themselves. And then when they sleep, they just want to sleep. So it goes into extremes. And sometimes people even get like diseases, the stress related diseases, like like things related to autoimmune stuff, and also like Bell palsy. All of those are stress related symptoms, diseases. And so if the intensity is kept up for a longer period of time, the more chances of having physical diseases resulting from the emotional stress.
I'd like to welcome my friend Ingrid. Ingrid, thank you so much for joining us. So, I have to ask you this. For people out there who have actually betrayed someone, whether they choose to admit it to themselves or not, but especially like I think of parents, they're alienated from their children. What would you say to them about, releasing your kids, releasing the person that you hurt? You know, do you think it's a good idea for them to at least make an apology, to try to right the wrongs, if that makes sense?
Yes, it's very important. Some parents find it in their heart, some parents are not able to. But if you could find it in your heart, it's important for your child's recovery. It it helps them to recover more speedily if they have at least that. If they have your apology, if they have your understanding, if you even listen, even if you don't understand everything and how it impacted them, just to apologize for what you understand, or apologize that this impacted them in this way. Just go for what they're explaining to you, because you don't know, you on the other side. So just take it, because they wouldn't bring this conversation up to you if they didn't have a real reason to, or if they weren't impacted by it. So it wouldn't hurt you to apologize and to, just be there and help them with their growth process and with their healing process.
And how can they go about starting such a dialogue?
Well, just open the conversation about, how were things growing up, and is there anything that I did or said that upset you, or anything that, from your childhood. I mean, now that you're adult and we can talk adult to adult, we can share if anything that may have bothered you, or anything where we need healing. And, if they remember something that they did, they could apologize for that. If they don't remember, then they open it up so that the adult child can share about what they experienced and how they experienced it.
Now, in a marriage, especially if something like adultery took place, or even if it's just an emotional affair,
Hmm.
the person who was betrayed, in many cases, they find it hard to forgive, they find it hard to move forward. How can a married couple reconcile if they have been through this? Is there a way to overcome that trauma of betrayal?
Yes, there is. Unfortunately, sometimes the betrayal from a spouse may have kind of triggered former betrayals, and that makes it more difficult sometimes. But it's possible. There's a process that we have to go through, though, because it's not an easy process. It's a difficult journey, but the rewards are phenomenal when you stick to the process, because there's always a reason or something that brought about whatever happened. So looking at the relationship and where the breach, or where there was this distance that was created to allow a third party, is going to be important, because if not, you won't be working on the root cause. And sometimes, you might say, okay, well, they stepped out, but it's a process that both of you have to address. Not just because when I've worked with couples, the feelings and emotions are similar when that offending spouse comes to the table. Most times they are feeling hurt as well, and they're feeling some of the same emotions, not in the same intensity,
Yes.
but when they're really sorry about what they did, when they really realize how much it hurt you, they're hurting too. And so working through that process is going to be important. We work with them individually first, and then when they're ready to come together, then we we bring them together for that exchange of the emotional piece, and then later on for the exchange of the apologies and forgiveness process, which is a whole phase in itself. and
Yes.
and then after we get through that whole part, then we go start from the ground and start rebuilding, because a lot of times in relationships, we didn't if you didn't have premarital, if you didn't have healthy boundaries in place, then sometimes things go awry, because they want certain things weren't planned for or mapped out. So it's going to be important to start from the foundation again to rebuild, because you have to rebuild trust. Just that trust, the mutual trust and mutual respect, and then working towards the loving actions again. So it's a process.
Opal has a comment here saying, very interesting. I'm going through this process right now. Thank you for sharing that, Opal. So I have to ask you this, Shirley.
Hmm.
If a couple has been able to work it out, there's
Hmm.
been a betrayal,
Hmm.
they've gone through the process. What if the betrayer repeats the offense?
That's a good question. And the thing is, we have to make sure that there are boundaries in place. And hopefully, the boundaries that are set is for both parties. and the accountability between parties should prevent this from happening. But if it does happen, then we have to go through the whole process over again, but it's much more difficult. And the spouse who's been offended, you know, they're going to have to make a decision whether or not they want to do this again. So, and it's depending on a lot of different circumstances.
Yes.
So that's something that we hope never happens, because
Yes.
most times I don't know whether or not they can recover. Um, but each situation is different, and so we take them on a case by case
Now,
basis.
in families where betrayal has taken place, like for instance, there's been adultery in the marriage,
Mhm.
do you find that the cycle tends to continue? You know, it's going from one generation to the next. Dad cheated, so the sons or the daughters may follow in the footsteps, or maybe mom was the cheater. Do
Mhm.
you find that this is something that the pattern keeps repeating in families?
Yes, it's common, but usually when we work with couples, we work with them on changing that, breaking that cycle. So even with teenagers now, when I work with them on relationship skills, we're talking about breaking cycles. Because if they're not preparing before, then putting the effort in before, it's more likely to happen. But if this is something that they're aware of and they're not focusing on, but they're doing what the prevention things, the opposite things, to work on keeping connected with their spouse, then that prevents it from happening. So we want to get couples earlier, and especially when they're doing premarital. A lot of times people do premarital and it's just a few sessions, it's just all fun. But some of these things, if they're not tackled in the premarital, then they become an issue in the marriage. So if there's a spouse who have any of this history, is important to be brought up. Even when you have people who cheat when they were girlfriend and boyfriend, it makes that mate kind of hypersensitive to it, and then it creates, sometimes it creates a problem because because they're so insecure that it impacts the marriage, because it becomes more like a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're so insecure to begin with. So that's something that needs to be addressed and the prevention put in place ahead of time so that they both could feel secure.
The ones that tend to betray, is
Mhm.
it because they don't honor or they don't respect the connection with the person that they are betraying, or is this from a place of low self-esteem?
Well, there are a lot of different reasons why people cheat. Sometimes it's like just being caught up in the emotional affair, and like somebody at work or somebody that they see, and not guarding the avenues, so they just kind of get swept away in it. Sometimes there's situations where they feel they're bored at home, so they step out because everything is like just same old. So they're bored. Sometimes it's that they're not taking time for each other. They're not being intentional about their marriage. So then somebody steps out. Somebody's too busy with work, or sometimes I see a lot of, recently I've been seeing couples who have affairs like right after they have a child, or in that phase. And I'm like, because they feel like the child has taken their place. So sometimes the man will step out, or sometimes, so there's a wide range of reasons why people cheat. And now they also, some people who don't respect the boundaries of marriage. And yes, you have a few of those, um, because they're not holding themselves responsible or accountable.
So Opal is asking, so she's like, are you saying once a cheater, always a cheater?
No, there are some people who are chronic cheaters. Like if they cheat twice, three times, and with different people, then
Yes.
usually those tend to carry on that way. When there's a situation where somebody cheated, they kind of got carried away in some situation, they're apologetic, they work through it, and they see the pain that it caused you, and they're
Yes.
willing to make those changes. Usually those are the ones that we're able to rebuild, and the relationships are much stronger, much better, because it was something that happened. It wasn't going on. You have people who are cheating for like years and years, and that's different because it's more like a lifestyle for them. Some
Yes.
people are cheating with multiple partners for years and years. That's a lifestyle. We don't call that
Yes.
like just an affair,
Right.
because affairs have like a cycle where within the first 6 months the excitement is building, but then on the other side it comes down. So during that first 6 months when everything is on a hype, you know, they're in a whole different world. And so when it starts coming down on the other side, then is when they're more likely to be in reality and say, well, what am I doing? And
Yes.
realizing that this is not what they want. But sometimes early on when that their fantasy stage, they're still like kind of carried away with the affair, with teenage affairs.
Yeah. Mhm. Is it possible for those who have suffered as a result of this trauma to heal?
Yes, it's difficult and it's a process. It's a journey, but healing is possible. Some people are not able to like take that person back. There's some people who are not able to go through the whole forgiveness process and all of that, and that's okay. Sometimes it's because of their past, sometimes it's because of the impact it have on them that they're not willing to go through that, and that's understandable. Um, because they're just not capable. They don't have it in them. So they just decide not to pursue the relationship anymore, but they still need to heal. They still need to go through that healing process, even if they choose not to reconcile.
Yes. How important is it for us to evaluate our connections? When I was younger, I was very carefree as far as friendships. Now that I'm older, I'm very careful of who I have in my circle. So, how important is it for us to really evaluate the people that we are connecting with and letting into our lives?
Well, it's very important because we need people. We need to have that network, but we need people who we can trust and who we can depend on. And so it's a process of testing before you go through different tests and see if you can rely on this person. This person came through with this, with that, and then the relationship builds. So it's a process, and getting to know that person before you let them in is important. Um, and understanding different people, different expectations, different
Yeah.
personality styles, so that you know what you're looking for in that friend. Because sometimes we have expectations from a friend that's not realistic based on that
Yes.
person's personality style or where they're coming from. So we need to evaluate all that before we put them in a certain position in our life.
How important is it to really pay attention to the red flags? Because I can tell you for every situational betrayal that I've had, there were always red flags that I chose to ignore.
Well, sometimes at the time that you're seeing the red flags, you don't really want to see them
True.
because you want what you want. and so
Yes, it's true.
and so you at that point you're willing to forego, or you're willing to take the risk, even you know that risk is there. You're willing to take it because of where you are in your life, and you just want what you want. So sometimes that's the case. I see that the most when people ignore the red flags because they might think, okay, well, I'll just do this temporarily, and it goes from temporary to okay, this is really, and then it gets deeper and they can't just back out as they thought they would be able to.
how important is it for us to have a dialogue with our children or with the young people in our life about relationships and about being careful with the people that they let into their lives and knowing when they need to walk away from certain connections?
Well, I think that's a very important question because young people today, they don't understand. They don't understand just because they think, okay, if this doesn't work out, we can just get a divorce. Or if this doesn't work out, we can just do this or that. But sometimes it becomes life and death, and they don't realize that initially until they're in it. And then sometimes young people say, oh, this is my life.
Yeah,
But sometimes the choices they make could impact their families, could affect their siblings. Sometimes in these domestic violence situations, they kill the parents, they kill siblings, they kill,
yeah,
so this is not something that they should take lightly, and they should always be open to counsel, because when they're in it, they can't see it. But when they're able to step back from it, then they're able to see really what was going on.
yes, yes. Opal is saying that sometimes men can come on pretty strong and they're really good at hiding, you
Hmm.
know. It's so, but the thing is, and I want to ask you about narcissism because I
Hmm.
know with narcissists, they tend to love bomb in the
Yeah,
beginning. You come on
that's
really
right.
strong. You're
That's
the
right.
most beautiful woman. Oh, I've never been able to relate to anyone like I relate to you. And
Hmm.
oh, our connection is so special.
Hmm.
They're very good at doing that. So I would like to ask you to touch on that because I think a lot of people, and I don't know if we just did not know about narcissism, but it's like all of a sudden this is on the rise and it's like it's happening more and more.
Yeah, so we're more aware.
Yes.
Um, and I think it's also increasing because the two ways that narcissism happens is through genetics, because most times in narcissistic families we see that it's being perpetuated, and also it's grown where people when people are abused or people are overindulged, the extremes produce the narcissist. So so it's important to recognize when you're engaged in a relationship with a narcissist. That's key. Everything is fast in the beginning. Everything
Yes.
is fast and intense, and it creates an addictive effect
Yes.
because you keep chasing that high that you had to begin with. And
Yes.
so even when you know the relationship is toxic and you want to leave it, that high is what keeps you, because you're still hooked on that hope to have that. And even though that high might be just by the time the relationship lasts a year or 2 years, that part of the relationship is just maybe 10, the most is 25%. The
Yes.
rest of the relationship is, you don't want, but you want that 25%. So you're hooked on that 25%, and that keeps you in the whole relationship. And
Yes.
and so you're stuck because you want that. I had a client tell me, well, I don't want this relationship, but I want this part of it. I said, well,
Yeah.
so they want to leave this relationship, but they want the hype of you know,
It's addictive. It's
yes, it
addictive. So
is addictive.
it's
Hmm.
very addictive. Let me ask you this.
Hmm.
So, for the individuals who have been love bombed, they've heard
Hmm.
all the sweet words.
Hmm.
They're trapped, they're intoxicated by
Hmm.
all that's taken place, but then all of a sudden they start to get the breadcrumbs.
Hmm.
What do you do when you get to that point where the person goes from calling you every day to calling you maybe once a month? You're calling, you're texting, you're doing like you're chasing that high that you had in the beginning. Like I've heard a lot of people who are addicted to drugs say that
Hmm.
they were always chasing that first
That
high, that
high,
very
yes.
first high, but they've
Hmm.
never been able to
You'll
have
never be able.
that.
You're never gonna have it again. You never. It's
So
never. It's never a
so
reality.
I think it's the same thing when you've been love bombed. It's like once the crumbs are coming, once you're being breadcrumbed and you're
Hmm.
trying to get back to that sweet spot, back to
Hmm.
that place
Hmm.
that was so wonderful in the beginning.
Hmm.
what can you say? What would you say to that person? They may not want to hear it, but something that would bring them back down to reality.
Well, the more available they are to that person, the least likely they're able to get anything. So that's when they have to start putting some boundaries in place. Because if they don't, that person's going to become more and more abusive until they're
Yes,
not going to be able to stay. So the sooner they're able to put some boundaries in place and call them on their behavior, the sooner they're able to be, if there's any chance of recovery or if there's any chance for the relationship. I mean, there's some narcissists that narcissism is on a spectrum. So
right.
you have some narcissists that you can work with and that you can, we can, I've helped couples who deal with narcissism and they're able to recover, but they need to understand how to put those boundaries in place and how to call the person
Yes,
on their behavior and acknowledge, and for that person to acknowledge what's going on. And once, but how I have to work with them separate and then together
yes,
constantly, because that's the only way to keep the narcissist honest and then to keep the boundaries in place and to still keep pumping up the other person, the non-narcissist, so that they could, because usually they're either em- empaths or they're usually, sometimes they're borderline, sometimes they have their own issues too.
yes,
So there's a lot that needs to be done. So I usually work with them separately and then we have joint sessions to work on what they're dealing with together. Because if not, it's too much to have them in the same meeting ongoing, because the narcissist will kind of overpower the other partner, and then it becomes abuse in the sessions,
yes.
emotional abuse in the sessions. So that's why we don't do them together. Once we realize that there's narcissism going on, because then it's not healthy.
What would you say about when a person gets to the point where they've decided, you know what, I'm going to go no contact. I don't want anything to do with this person. The person may send some text messages or whatever's with, really trying to entice that person back in.
Hmm. Hmm.
What would you say to that person who has just made up their mind, but they may be tempted? They get the text messages, but it's like they don't know whether they should give that person another chance or not.
Go back to the memories of the worst times they had, because that will
Yes.
keep you from the temptation. And just think, do you want to relive that cycle? Because you see the cycles, and I have clients write it down so that
Yes.
they have everything with the cycles. And then, because when they decide to leave, it's because they've documented, they've seen the cycles, they know this is not how they want to live their life.
Right.
And that's why we go through the time and process of that, so that they know when they're ready, they're ready. So by the time they're ready to leave, they know it's no turning back. And I say, pull off that flip. When you have a cut and you have that flap over, healing is not going to come when you keep that flap over. So you clean cut and let's work on healing. And they need to stay in therapy, because that will help them to be accountable, because they say they're done. So the therapist will help them say, okay, you said you're done, let's work on your healing. And so they're not going to be as tempted as if they don't have the support.
Yes. So for the person that's decided to walk away, they're sick and tired of the betrayal. There may be some feelings of resentment and anger. What would you say to that individual about working those feelings out? Because I can tell you that from my personal experience,
Hmm.
there was a time when I had a lot of animosity, a lot of hatred, a lot of anger, and I didn't like what it was doing to me.
Hmm.
And I had to get to that point where I had to learn to forgive and let go. And when I forgave, I wasn't saying that what they did to me was okay, but it was my way of releasing that person so I could move on and not
Hmm.
replay it in my mind over and over, the hurt and all of that. So
Yeah,
what
because it's consuming.
Yes.
It's very consuming, and you're giving that person power over your life, even though you're saying you're cutting them off. So they're still controlling your life. Sometimes I
Yes.
work with clients who that person is already deceased, but they're still controlling them from the grave.
Yes.
So that's how intrusive it could be. That's how consuming it could be. So you don't want that, and that's the reason why you have to go through that letting go and releasing process and
Yes.
forgiveness. But that's
I
a
agree there.
whole another
Yeah.
topic that we can do another time about forgiveness,
Yes.
because that's a big one, a big part of
That is a
the
big
healing
one.
process.
Andrew and I covered that a few weeks, but I would like for you to
Good.
come back and do that because I think that that's where a lot of people are stuck.
Mhm,
Betrayal is a very bitter pill to swallow. Being
mhm,
hurt by someone you loved is really tough. But
mhm.
I think that many of us do ourselves a disservice when we don't want to let it go. Like if I
Mhm.
hate that person, it's not necessarily going to hold them back in life. I'm only holding myself back. So
Yes,
it's like we feel like, oh, this is my revenge when you're really hurting yourself. What would you like to say about that?
definitely. Definitely. You're still having that person control you. They're
Yes.
still controlling you from wherever they are. I've seen it in a different state, in a different country, and still they're able to control you. And
Yes.
another thing that they tend to do is they'll kind of pop up in different times. Like they'll wait for months or sometimes years and they'll call you, or they'll pop up with something on your social media, try to get to you
Yeah.
somehow. And that's a way of control, of trying to see if they could still manipulate you.
Right.
It's a power tripping thing where they're trying to see if
It's
they could
true.
still manipulate you. So that's
It's
why
true.
you want to be at a point where you're forgiven, where you've done, where you're clean, so that those things don't bother you and you're not triggered by it. You're not sucked back into it because and you're in a different place.
Yes. Yeah, I think that makes such a difference. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast tonight because I wanted people out there to understand that you can move on with your life and you can still lead a very happy and productive life, but you have to make that choice on whether you want to move forward or not.
Yes.
So, I would like you to address what would you like to say to those who are suffering? Would you say it's a choice to suffer?
Yes. I would say get help now, get help tonight, get help today, go online, sign up for a therapist, do something because it's not healthy. And you need to be specific about the kind of therapist you're going to look for because all therapists are not created equal.
True.
Sad to say, but so you need to look for a therapist who is familiar with dealing trauma. If you're dealing with narcissism, you need a therapist who is familiar with narcissism, abuse, those kind of things. Because if you get the wrong therapist, it'll take you a longer time. So you don't have to settle with whoever you get first. Make sure that you're you're comfortable with the person because they're going to be walking alongside you through this journey, and you
Yes.
need it to be somebody who understands, somebody who could connect with you, somebody who you can trust with this process. So it needs to be somebody who's done it before, somebody who's who's going to be there and do it well, so that you're not hurting more in the process, because sometimes you can be more hurt and more traumatized if you not getting the right help. But
That
get
is
help
so true.
today.
That is so true. And Andrew says, Amen, make the hard choice. So I would have to ask you this. What can we as individuals do to help? I can tell you that there are some people in their approach, I know they mean well. But
Mhm,
if you're telling, basically, you're making the person feel foolish.
mhm,
I remember when I was younger and my mom, there were boyfriends I had that my mom didn't like, and she would criticize them. But
mhm.
what it did, it made me want to prove to her that she was wrong. And
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily even care about these guys, but because mommy said something, I wanted to prove to my mom that she was wrong. And she
Mhm,
was right, by the way. She was definitely right. So,
mhm.
how can we approach our loved ones who are in the wrong situation? We see it, we know it, and deep down we know that they know it too. How
Mhm.
do we address this?
I think having an open conversation, but not telling them, just
Yes,
asking them what's the best thing they like about him. What are some of the things that, you know, that they think they would like to see change, or let it be from them, not from you. And
yes,
then you help them with whatever it is that they say, so that it's on their terms, not yours. When I'm dealing with clients like that, we just kind of put the story together. We put it together as to what's happening and what you're seeing. And as they paint the picture, then you're able to say, well, can we brush here up a little bit more? What do you think about that? And then you can talk to them about flags. Well, that seems like that's a flag. Do you think that, because it's usually a lot of little things that you could excuse away when you're dating. But
yes,
then when you get in a committed relationship, you see it all played out.
yes,
So when you're looking at it from their perspective of looking at the painting, or what they tell you about it, then you can share back with them. Well, you said he liked this, or he did that, or just because the order didn't come the way he wanted it, he yelled at the people who were
yes.
bringing them the order. So you can share these little flags. So you say he's this, but you said he did that, and then they're going to start seeing it for themselves. But you trying to tell them doesn't work. But just
That is so true. That is so true. I'd like to welcome my friend Sonia, who's watching in Canada. Thank you so much for joining. I have to ask you this question, Sister Shirley. For those who they have seen the betrayer doing whatever, is that something that they should keep to themselves, or should they? Because I remember a friend of mine saying to me years ago, she asked me, if her husband was cheating and I saw him in the act, saw him out with another woman, would I tell her? And I said, no, I would not. And she was offended by that. But I told her, I don't believe it would be my place to say anything to you. I said, now I would say something to him. I would let him know, hey, hey, I'm just letting you know I see what you're doing, but I would not feel right about being the one to tell someone something like that, because I personally think it would be cruel.
and sometimes you don't know all the circumstances, so it's better
Yes,
you talk to that person,
yes,
because it could be something that it's somebody that he needs to work with something on, or you never know the
yes,
circumstances. And so it's better to talk to that person and address it with them. And then if they persist, say, how do you think your wife may feel, or how do you think your husband might feel? Whatever it is, address it with them. And but if sometimes people say, well, you're my friend and you won't
yes.
tell me that's happening. So, but how would you address that person? Would you talk to them about maybe connecting with their spouse a little bit more, or giving them some pointers in terms of, you know, so that you're not telling them this is happening because you don't know the details, but you're just telling them about connecting,
Yes,
about spending time, or when last y'all went on a date, or just like checking in with them if they're your friend. If they're
yes,
not your friend, then they're not gonna even want to hear what you have to say anyway.
true.
So I would do that. I would share with them just about things about connecting, and then that way they will find out for themselves, because once you're connected, you sense that something is going on. When you're not connected, then you don't know.
I
But
definitely agree with you. I definitely agree with you on that. You know, one of the things, I have been on a healing journey for the past 2 years. And as I've said to the viewers every week, that is why I do this podcast. One of the things I came to realize was that as I got closer and deeper in my relationship with God,
mm,
as I found out, because I really got to a place of, because I realized in the past I didn't have that personal relationship. But
mm,
as that personal relationship developed and I felt the love of God, what
mm,
that love did for me was it allowed me to love myself.
mm,
It allowed me to respect myself. And it allowed me to have a standard for myself that I can truly tell you in the past I didn't have it, if I'm to be
mm,
honest.
mm,
So I believe, and this is just my personal belief, I believe that there are some people that should not be in my life There are some people that I choose not to have in my life because I believe that if I allow them to continue to mistreat me, to abuse me, whatever it is, I believe that I am betraying myself.
Hmm.
So I would like to ask you, what is your opinion on that?
Definitely. God didn't intend for us to be in relationship to be abused. In fact, he modeled the marriage relationship as his relationship, Jesus's relationship to his church. And so it's supposed to be a holy and sacred relationship.
Yes,
And so bringing people into your life who's not going to be uplifting, who's not going to resemble that relationship is not going to be healthy. And if you can't feel connected with that person, then it's not going to work out, because when you're connected in that love relationship, you're able to sense when something is off.
true.
You know, it's just knowing each other and being able to communicate and connect, because you're attached to this person,
Yes,
not just physically but emotionally, spiritually. You can sense, and like you said, with your relationship with God, God always shows us things that are going on as well.
yes,
People don't really, that if they're not connected, they won't see. But he has a way of showing us and what's going on if we're listening or if we're paying attention.
I
So,
agree.
yeah,
I definitely agree. I'd like to thank you so much. This was very informative, and I hope the viewers really will take the time to listen to this again. Please feel free to share this to those who you believe could really, this would be helpful to them. And I would like to ask you, Shirley, do you have any closing thoughts? And I definitely would like you to come back, by the way.
sure. Well, in closing, I just want to say that when you're considering relationships, they're impactful in your life. So you want to take your time, you want to prayerfully consider, you want to educate yourself. Now there's so many resources out there. So if you're coming from a place where you say, I don't want to be like my mom, I don't want to be like my dad, please don't focus on not being like somebody. Figure out a model as how you want to be. What's the model, and focus on that, because then you'll have something to focus on, something to kind of be intentional about becoming, rather than what you don't want. Because what you don't want, if you focus on that, that's what you're going to be. So even if your parents were narcissists or whatever the situation is, you have an opportunity to grow, and you don't have to be that.
Yes.
Because I've worked with narcissists who are in the healing process.
So there is definitely hope. There is hope.
Yes, yes,
There is
there's
hope.
hope. It's hard, it's work, but there's hope.
And that's the perfect way to end this tonight. I'd like to thank all of you who joined this episode. If you watch the replay later, please feel free to leave your questions and comments. And I'd like to thank everyone that tuned in tonight. And I look forward to seeing you next week. My guest next week will be Irene Roper, who will be sharing her journey on diabetes in part one. This will be a two-parter with Irene. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Good night.